Hello, I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges in interpreting Messianic prophecy. Now, we're not going to focus on any one particular prophetic oracle in this session. Rather, we want to look at some of the background issues that affect the way that different people approach the problem of interpreting Messianic prophecy. And in particular, we want to take up the problem that's raised by the Reformation interpretive principle that every text has one literal sense. We'll do this in two parts. In the first part, we'll define the problem and look at an example of the kind of problem that arises in interpreting a text because of the issue that we identify. And then in the second session, we'll identify a solution and apply it to a test case to see how it works. So let's begin with the question. The question is why? That is to say, why do Christians expect to find prophecies about the coming of the Messiah in the Old Testament or in the Tanakh? Well, there's not just one answer to this question. In fact, there are a variety of reasons. One reason might be that that's just the way that Christians see the world, and there's some truth to that. After all, from the perspective of historic Christianity, Christ is the center of all things. He's the center of history. He's the center of my life. He's the center of human desire and the center of God's creative work. So Christ is the center of all things, and as center of all things, he's certainly the center of the whole Scripture. So it's true that to a certain extent, Christians expect to find prophecies about the coming of the Messiah in the Tanakh because that's just the way that Christians view the world. But that's not the only reason. Another reason that Christians expect to find prophecies about the coming of the Messiah in the Tanakh lie in the words of Jesus himself. So, as the evangelist St. John recorded in John chapter 5, "You search the Scriptures," Jesus said, "because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it is they that bear witness about me." So, Jesus here is saying that we should expect to find two things in the Scriptures. And when Jesus is talking about the Scriptures, he's talking about the Tanakh, the Old Testament Scriptures. So as you read the Scriptures, Jesus says you should find there two things. You should find there first the teaching of the way to eternal life, and secondly, the teaching about who Jesus is. The point here is that we wouldn't know who the Messiah is. We wouldn't know that Jesus was the Messiah if it were not for the witness of the Tanakh. So the words of Jesus himself push us in the direction of finding prophecies about the coming of the Messiah in the Tanakh. But beyond the words of Jesus, it's not just the words of Jesus, but really the messianic expectation of the entire New Testament leads us in that direction. So if we look at not just the gospel accounts, but all the epistles and other New Testament writings, they are replete with instances in which the biblical authors call upon the Tanakh to evidence the coming of Jesus as the Messiah. In almost every book, you'll find some instance of some allusion or quotation or way of communicating the idea that Jesus is the fulfillment to which the Old Testament was working and unfolding throughout the history of God's people. But even beyond that, I think there's one other factor, and that's really the messianic expectation of the Tanakh itself. Now, I realize that not everyone reads the Old Testament and sees the Messiah there. Much of modern Judaism doesn't read the Old Testament that way. In part, that's a reaction against Christian claims rather than the way that Jews have always read the Old Testament. There's plenty of evidence from the intertestamental period and from the first centuries that Jews of that time certainly read the Old Testament with a view to finding there a witness to the coming of the Messiah. But beyond that, also there are Christians who don't read the Old Testament and find Christ there. From the perspective of historic Christianity, we would think of that as an aspect of liberal Christianity, because liberal Christianity, influenced by historical criticism, it tends to read the Old Testament, or rather the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, as merely what it calls relecturing. That is to say, finding after the fact, or making some connection after the fact with something in the Old Testament and reinterpreting and reapplying it to this situation, not claiming that that's actually what was expected or that was the original interpretation, but it has been, they would argue, reinterpreted or reapplied in light of the belief that Jesus was the Messiah. And this way of reading the scriptures is really a very fundamental divide between historic Christianity and liberal Christianity. So, because for historic Christianity, as we've said, the whole of the scriptures point to Christ. But for historical critical Christianity, there's no question that the prophet is always and really only speaking to his own day. Now, this is not a new view. This view we can trace back at least as far as the 18th century. Anthony Collins, the English divine, wrote in 1724 a work on reason and the Christian faith, in which he argues that he argues against the traditional understanding of Messianic prophecy, largely on the grounds that the prophets spoke always and only to their own day. This view became so common within historical critical circles that by the beginning of the 19th century, the German scholar Johann Eichhorn could claim and claim as a boast, as a matter of pride, that he had erased the Messiah from the Old Testament. So this is a major divide between the way that historical criticism reads the Bible and the way that traditional Christian interpretation reads the Bible. But we have to be careful not to oversimplify this and simply say that conservatives believe in prophecy and liberals don't, although that is generally true. Because the conservative position is really much more complex and nuanced than most people realize, because it has to deal with the question of how we understand to whom the prophet speaks. In other words, does the prophet speak exclusively to his own day, as historical criticism would maintain? Does the prophet speak exclusively to the future, to the time of the Messianic age, or in some cases the eschaton? Or do prophets somehow speak to both? And this really is the central problem in interpreting Messianic prophecy, because since the time of the Reformation, it has been common to argue that one of the chief principles for interpreting the Bible correctly is to recognize that each text has one literal sense. The phrase in Latin, unus sensus literalis. So if a prophet is speaking in some sense to both his own time and to the future, how do we reconcile this with the principle that each text has only one literal sense? And that's a problem that we're going to have to explore because the answer to this really lies in recognizing that there are different kinds of prophecy in the Bible. The first kind of prophecy that I would like to talk about is what we typically call typology. I prefer to call it typological prophecy because it is really prophecy. It is God foreshadowing what he intends to do in the future. What makes typology or typological prophecy distinctive is that it's in the form of a person or place or thing or event, and that person, place, thing, or event foreshadows or anticipates a fulfillment, or maybe we would be better to say a filling out that is to come in the future. So what are the characteristics of typology? Well, first, it's nonverbal. That is to say, by definition, typology is not speech that anticipates the future, but action or thing that anticipates the future. It's God revealing his plans through a nonverbal instrument. The second thing about typology is that it's not just symbolism. Typology deals in historical realities with a real thing, person, place, or event that foreshadows or anticipates another real thing, person, place, or event. The foreshadowing we typically call the type. The fulfillment or the filling out we typically call the antitype. Another thing about type and antitype, or foreshadowing and fulfillment, is that the antitype, the fulfillment, is always in some way greater than the foreshadowing or the type. And the last thing that I'd like to mention about typology or typological prophecy is that it's often fulfilled in stages. So, for example, in the Old Testament, we get the tabernacle, which then leads to the temple, Solomon's temple and the second temple, which in turn leads to the incarnation, the Christ as the temple, the place of the presence of God within creation. And so Jesus associates himself, his person and his body with the temple. So the incarnation is the completing or filling out of the anticipatory action of God in giving his people the tabernacle and temple as the place where his presence was manifest in the world, foreshadowing the reality of the presence of God in the world in Jesus Christ. So that's typology or typological prophecy. The other classic kind of prophecy is typically called rectilinear prophecy. And by rectilinear prophecy, we refer to verbal prophecy. That is, rectilinear prophecy is words. It's verbal prophecy that speaks directly and exclusively to some fulfillment in the future. So rectilinear prophecy preserves the predictive nature of prophecy. It's genuine prophecy. So let's take a look at an example of a rectilinear prophecy. Here we have the words of the prophet Micah from chapter 5, verses 2 to 5 in English, or 1 to 4 in Hebrew. The prophet speaks, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, for you shall come forth to me one who is to be ruler in Israel." So here Micah prophesies that there will come from Bethlehem one who will rule over Israel. And not just anyone who will rule over Israel, but one whose coming forth is of old. In other words, this is not a normal sort of a person who's going to be old, to be born, rather. This is one who his actual origins is from far in the past. And then he goes on to say, "Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel." And one can argue whether this is referring to the diaspora of Israelites who will return and this is be my preferred interpretation, that this is a reference to bringing in the Gentiles into and grafting them into the people of Israel. But in any case, it goes on to say, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will dwell secure, for now he will be great to the ends of the earth. So this is one who will be great to the ends of the earth, and not only that, he will be the one who will bring them shalom, who will bring them peace. So Micah prophesies the coming of a future ruler who will bring shalom to not just Israel, but to all those who are scattered, who will be brought into the people of Israel. And this is one who comes from of old. So the New Testament clearly understands this to be a reference to the birth of Jesus. And so Matthew in chapter 2 quotes this, saying, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So clearly here, Matthew is citing this passage and applying it in the context to the birth of Jesus. But Matthew isn't the only one who sees it this way. The Gospel of John also alludes to this passage, although it doesn't quote it as extensively as Matthew does. And even St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, draws upon this passage when he says of Jesus, he himself is our peace. So there's a clear understanding in the New Testament that this prophecy of Micah refers to the coming of Jesus. The question is whether it refers to anyone else or whether these words are directly and exclusively about Jesus and about no one else. Well, that's a question that's almost impossible for us to answer, except that from history we don't see anyone else who could possibly be the obvious fulfillment of this. Certainly no one whose coming is from of old who could be the fulfillment of this. And you can argue none that brings shalom to the people of God either. So this is, to the best we can tell, perhaps an example of rectilinear prophecy, a verbal prophecy that speaks directly and exclusively to a future fulfillment, in this case in the coming of Christ. Now, I mention this because by the middle of the 19th century, the argument had developed that rectilinear prophecy has one and only one fulfillment, and that fulfillment is in the New Testament era. So E.W. von Hingstenberg, in his Christology of the Old Testament and commentary on Messianic prophecies, draws upon the principle of one literal sense. And he says that that one literal sense is to be found in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament. So where there appears to be some kind of conflict or confusion, the one meaning was the New Testament meaning. There's no application to the prophet's time at all. So if you follow von Hingstenberg's approach to prophecy, you have to end up recognizing that the prophets were not speaking to their own time, even if they thought they were, because a strict rectilinearist like von Hingstenberg would suggest that prophecy has no meaning whatsoever in its original historical context, except perhaps the vague and general meaning of giving people a hope for the future. Now, I mention this because this leads to something of a hard alternative that people are faced with. And that's the alternative between the historical critical view and this very strict rectilinearist view represented by Hingstenberg. So for historical criticism, criticism begins with the Reformation principle of one literal sense, and it adds to that the dictates of human reason, which suggests that there is no such thing as prophecy. And if there is no such thing as prophecy, and there's only one literal sense, then the one literal sense can only be the prophet speaking to his own time. By contrast, the view of historic Christianity, as represented by von Hingstenberg, also begins with the principle that each text has only one literal sense, but it is guided not by human reason, but by faith, which believes that prophecy is possible. And if there is only one literal sense, and if that sense, that one literal sense is in the future, then it must be the case that the prophets were speaking to the time of the fulfillment and not at all to their own time. Let's look at an example of how this works its way out in practice. An example we'll take from the book of the prophet Hosea, from chapter 11, where we read, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, just right before the passage that we were looking at a moment ago, Matthew says, "Then rising he," that is referring to Joseph, "took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. He was there until the death of Herod, in order that the saying from the Lord through the prophet should be fulfilled, out of Egypt I called my son." So Matthew clearly understands Hosea's prophecy to be fulfilled in the going down of Jesus with his family to Egypt and the return after the death of Herod. Now, if we were to look in more detail at the book of Hosea, it would be obvious that as Hosea understands this is clearly a reference to the book of Exodus. But as we've seen, in the context of the book of Matthew, this is clearly a reference to Jesus. Well, if the principle of one literal sense applies here, then we're forced to ask the question, who is wrong? Because if we begin with Hosea, and we see here a reference to the Exodus, for a strict rectilinearist like von Hingstenberg, Hosea simply didn't understand what he was saying, since the one literal sense must be a reference to Jesus. Therefore, Hosea was simply wrong in declaring that he was talking about the Exodus, or to the extent that he thought he was talking about the Exodus. On the other hand, if we look at the Gospel of Matthew from that context, this is undoubtedly a reference to Jesus. But for historical critical interpreters, the one literal sense of Hosea was about the Exodus, and if Matthew thought it was about Jesus, then Matthew was wrong. Or alternately, perhaps, Matthew was just making up a connection in order to suit his theological purposes. So this is what happens if you adopt the principle of one literal sense and connect that with the notion of rectilinear prophecy. You're going to be faced with a situation where you're going to have to say either the prophet was a false prophet and was wrong, or else the evangelist or New Testament writer was simply making up a connection that didn't actually exist. As critical scholars would say, he was relecturing the text. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me for this session in which we introduced one of the most fundamental methodological problems in the area of Messianic prophecy. I hope you'll join me for our next segment in which we take a look at an answer.